Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I don't even know what to tell you. I mean, I'm up and down. I'm still kind of wrestling with some sort of anxiety and depression hybrid, and I got a side of anhedonia with that, and all I could say is I'm doing my best. I had a couple of really good conversations today, actually, with friends I know through work, which is to say, friends of mine. They're just not podcast side friends. They're the guys I've met over the years, doing my job. And they're really different talks. One was during a 6-mile run this morning. The guy's part of our running group. But both times we got to, kind of share things with one another. And maybe each time we help the other with some of the stuff that's sort of plaguing our underminds. That said, the second great conversation I had was a phone call that came just as I was about to start recording this intro after work, because I kind of got postponed this morning and everything and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I totally lost my thread and what I was going to talk about in the intro. So let's get to this week's show, and we can deal with my mental health some other time. So this week's guest is Anne Cattaneo, who is the author of the new book, The Art of Dramaturgy, from Yale University Press. Came out a couple of weeks ago. I connected with Anne a few years back from a suggestion with a past guest and friend, David Leopold. Her prospective guest entry in my great spreadsheet that knows all just read textbook, dramaturgy under the topics column. At the time, I had no idea what dramaturgy actually was, and that's part of the joke of our conversation and the book itself. But I will tell you, The Art of Dramaturgy is a textbook of sorts, but even for a guy like me who does not plan on becoming a dramaturg and didn't get out to the theater enough, even in the before times, this book is marvelous. Anne uses her decades of experience to illustrate the role of a theater's dramaturg or literary director, which is a little more descriptive, might help you understand some of what the job entails. And she goes into the process of researching a play's roots and its historical context in order to provide actors and directors with more material to inform their performance. But she also writes about the dramaturg's more upstream role, I guess, of assessing plays, reading scripts, suggesting what should be added to a theater's repertory, sending plays to other theaters that might be a good fit, sometimes commissioning playwrights to write something, although she's got a whole thing in there about commissions. And part of what makes the book so great is she has all this experience in theater and goes into some of the economics of theater and what goes into playwriting and putting on a play. And it's a really fascinating book. And there is a sense that she conveys of like how the work of a dramaturg sort of parallels that of a literary editor, especially in terms of working with playwrights to help them better realize their vision. But also, once the play is in production, or even before it gets to that point, working to help shape it even after it's been written, which to me, and I talk about this, is not exactly my thing, because I'm used to being a micromanaging control freak and having a fixed object that you make, and this sense of theater being organic and how scripts and production sort of evolves. It's absolutely fascinating, like I said, and throughout, and brings in her work as the dramaturg for Lincoln Center Theater and elsewhere. And she focuses on a couple of key productions. So you get to see this stuff in practice, the way she breaks out, what went into making Stoppard's Coast of Utopia trilogy, the 1,000-year-old play, The Orphan of Zhao, a Robert Wilson production of Hamlet Machine. And there's a whole section on this amazing process of developing and staging this lost play by Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. And all of this stuff goes to show how a dramaturg can help enhance a production or help work through a play's thornier problems, or the holes that are sometimes left. And anyway, at the same time, like I said, she has plenty of commentary about theater in America, its economics, representation, and credit, what gets produced and what doesn't, and why it's critical to have more diverse voices, and how there have been a couple of different waves of playwriting over the decades in America lately. And anyway, it's it's a textbook, and it's a personal work. And as you'll get from our conversation, Anne is self-effacing. And she talks about how she likes the anonymity of being a dramaturg. But the book is informed by her life and what she's done and the joy she takes in the theater. So it makes it a really, really good read. Anyway, this conversation is, we're going to thank a lot of people who go into making theater and a lot of individuals who she's worked with over the years. And she really does appreciate that communal aspect of the audience, witnessing a play in a specific moment, and the community of actors and designers and technicians and others who have to work together for months before that to bring a play to life. So The Art of Dramaturgy and Cattaneo, absolute joy to read. As caveats go, we recorded in person at her place in New York, so there's some street noise. Also, she mentions Bernie. We were talking before we started recording. Well, we were recording, but I cut that part out, about Bernard Gersten, who was the executive producer at Lincoln Center Theater for about 25 years. Sounds like a heck of a character if you check out his Wikipedia page. And so when she mentions Bernie, that's who she's talking about. When she mentions Wendy, that's Wendy Wasserstein, who she writes a wonderful, wonderful piece about in the book too. Anyway, here's Anne's bio from the book. There's a more comprehensive version on her site, which is theartofdramaturgy.com. I will have a link to that in the show notes for this one. Anne Cattaneo is the longtime dramaturg of Lincoln Center Theater and creator and head of the 25-year-old Lincoln Center Theater's Directors Lab. At the announcement of her 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship for Theater Arts, American Theater Magazine saluted her as a quote-unquote legendary dramaturg. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Anne Cattaneo. I guess as a basic question, before we ask where the book came from, what is dramaturgy? Because in the book, you do say primarily no one knows exactly what it means.
It's a profession that has existed for some time. It's been quite established in Germany. It was originally, first person who was the dramaturg was the great German playwright Lessing. But Brecht was a dramaturg. A lot of people in the 20s in Berlin were dramaturgs. There's a tradition of dramaturgy in England. And here it started in the 70s, which corresponded with the basically the creation of the regional theaters, which were created by a large foundation grant that built the Arena, the La Jolla Playhouse, the Denver Theater Center, all the theaters, which by sheer fate of luck and whatever, corresponded with this tremendous, unexpected outpouring of plays by people from all over the country that did have a kind of regional character. There was sort of the Chicago school, David Mamet and Steve Tessich, and the Lanford Wilson, August Wilson sort of represented the Midwest, and then you had Sam Shepard and the Western writers. there was quite a variety in terms of styles. There was a big Philadelphia school, Charles Fuller, David Rabe, Bill Gunn. Some were experimental writers, some were very traditional writers. And as soon as the theaters opened, scripts started pouring in, and nobody knew what to do with them. I mean, they built the theaters, but who was going to work there? What would be the staffing? And so all of us, just by sheer fortune, were there to initially just deal with these, mountain of manuscripts. I mean, I have pictures of my cat, now dead for 30 years, sitting on a pile of manuscripts. And we all became friends. And when you find something that you love, you try and talk your theater into doing it. And sometimes you're successful. But if you're not, then you give it to a friend and say, why don't you do this play? Or this seems like your kind of a play. It's a circle rep kind of a play, or it's a public kind of a play, or it's whatever. And so that's really when the profession began here, was, I would say, the mid to late 70s. And it's because there were theaters and because there were, by sheer fortune, this wave of playwrights. And as I always say, you have to remember that we are a nation of immigrants, even though we're having all these battles about this now. And I think at the time that the Ford Foundation created the grants to build the theaters, Lincoln Center was one of them, designed by Eero Saarinen and Joe Meltziner. All of these theaters were built around the country. I think 3% of the American population had ever been in a theater. I mean, we're not a nation like Germany is, that's been going to theater for 300 years. And as my father used to say, there's a reason that there's an opera house in San Francisco that's 100 years older than the opera house in Los Angeles. I grew up in the Bay Area. Yeah. And that's because, going to the coast of Utopia, where I know you'll go at some point, there was the Revolution of 1848. And everybody who was involved in the Revolution of 1848 was a really, interesting, iconoclastic, activist kind of thinker. They all lost, and they were all in danger of being jailed. And gold was discovered in San Francisco in 1849. So they all went to San Francisco. And the first thing they needed was an opera company. And that's the reason it was founded then. And Los Angeles was founded by pioneers who had to take wagon trains out. And so there is an opera company, but it's 100 years younger than San Francisco. So I think the statistics now are that more people, well, this is pre-COVID, more people go to the theater in America than go to professional football games. I mean, the theaters were very popular once they were built, but it's very young. I mean, we really have a tradition that's now just 50 years old, and we forget how new it is.
Beyond that role, though, the initial role was a reader. How did the role of dramaturg develop, both for you and for the we'll say profession? I mean,
I think we began as readers and as recommenders, and once you read and recommend, and you're lucky enough to have your play get a green light, then you can't just leave. You sort of go to rehearsals, you stick around, and plays are written. Obviously, the primary creator is the playwright, but then plays morph and change in rehearsal, and it's very hard to have a completed play without that rehearsal process. The playwright, led by the director, works with the companies. That's always a very interesting but delicate project. Will the actors be good enough? How will they influence it's a fascinating process. I mean, really exciting to be part of. And so you're kind of, without knowing it, led into the rehearsal room. And there are many plays, especially plays where all of the given circumstances, as actors would say, are known by everybody, contemporary plays, that everybody understands. If you say, I'm going to Brooklyn, everybody knows where that is, or whatever. But if you have a line that says, like in As You Like It, I am the second son of Sir Roland Du Bois, that doesn't mean that you have an older brother. It does, but it means a whole lot of other things. And so it ends up that all kinds of information needs to come into the room. And a lot of times that information comes in with the actors. They carry everything. But in some cases, having, worked on the play or commissioned the play, you know things, or you've done research on things that you can bring in. And some actors, and obviously I haven't mentioned directors because that usually starts ahead of time, want a lot of this stuff and some don't. I mean, each collaboration is different. I have worked on so many plays, but I love plays that are complicated, and that drive a big emotional reaction among audiences, and one that is different for every audience member. And Bernie and I, that's perhaps one. Everyone had a bond with Bernie. I did too. I mean, he used to say that there was an undiscovered particle of nature called the theatron, and it was a particle that was generated by actors, sent into the audience, but it had to come back to the actors. And once the theatrons were moving between the stage and the house and the stage and the house, that's when great theater was created, that everybody had to do that together. And creating that environment requires, I guess every profession has this, an assessment of how much the actors can take, how much work the director has done, the more the better, what you can fill in on. And so that's, the job is to really maximize artistic information, artistic excellence, which is in terms of older plays, carried down through the ages, largely through actors and scholars. But then I also had worked early in my career as a translator, and I translated a play at a great, great theater in the late 70s in Berlin, the Schaubühne, led by Peter Stein. And they had two of the absolutely most brilliant dramaturgs on their staff, Boto Strauss and Dieter Sturm. And I went there to do this translation that was published by Farrar Straus. And I sort of picked it all up from them. I mean, It's not like they gave me lessons or anything, but I just, through osmosis and conversation. So I was lucky enough, and that's a very theatrical thing. It's like an apprentice tradition. You hold the book and you watch actors, if you're a young actor, and you see how they behave. You see what a company leader is. You listen to what directors say. And that's a very big part of our field, which is just we're a tribe. We carry those traditions down. And I'm part of the tribe that doesn't want to be left on the stage. I want to be in the audience. Most people want to be on the stage, but I don't. But there are little mentions of that through the book. I mean, listening to a director like Mark Lemos in a classical play they're always in Shakespeare, guards who double as, whatever, soldiers who double as, and he would say to them, "You're carrying the show. When you stand without lines on stage and listen to the two leading actors' conversation, the audiences will be looking at you. And if you're sitting there going, or if you're really involved and invested, and that is going to make the show." And that is such a smart observation. It seems obvious, but it's smart. So those are the kinds of things you learn when you just spend a lot of time in rehearsal. You learn, best practices, you learn what's useful, and you learn what not to say.
Yeah. And I will ask what those things are in a moment. But in that case, given that it's a thing that you had to learn through osmosis, and I say the same thing about my own job. When people ask about this weird industry that I cover, I give them all the background in the world, because in 1999, when I had to learn it, there was no background. And I told people, I wish to God this existed for me when I was starting out. So here's all my resources to get you going. Does that mean we have something in common when it comes to publishing The Art of Dramaturgy?
Well, I was approached by Yale to write this book. It seems like 50 years ago, but I think it was more like 4. And I realized I didn't have a lot to pass down, but I had no idea how to do that. And it was very hard to figure it out. I mean, I obviously have no real... I mean, no one's interested in me, and I have no interest in, writing my
here,
writing my.
But okay.
But how do you do this? Because the nightmare that I had, is that it would turn out to be anything resembling one of those books, like How to Write a Screenplay. Introduce the protagonist on page 3, and introduce the antagonist within at least 4 minutes. I mean, that will just produce dreck. It has to be. Each time that a young or old person does a show different, it has to be changed. It's eternally changing. But yet I feel there are certain, that's what the book is, guidelines. So then I had to make a list of what I have needed in my life. The scholarly research that you need to do, the access to past information that's handed down by actors, how to support writers, how to look at a larger field and see what's needed or what's not needed. And then I would have to find examples from my endlessly long career that fit it. I mean, there were many other shows I could have written about. And I thought originally I would write about it without using the word I. It was just impossible. I mean, there was just no way to do it. So it ended up being I, and then the editor, ended up changing editors, but the editor I had at that point said, maybe you should just write a little short bio. So when you say, I was at Lincoln Center, we know that you went to Lincoln Center, because which ended up being kind of funny. You hand out the brochures, is really how you get the job. But it ended up being more, and there were more personal than I thought, and there were many plays that I worked on that I wish I could have written about, but it was already so long that I needed to cover classics, because that's just such a fascinating thing to do, and so I did two classics, and then many of them are so great that you can, and it's very hard to do, that you can interpret them. And then I ended the book reinterpreting it. If they're great enough, like we all know, you could do it another time. Probably you should wait a little while. And I wanted to end with Brecht because he's fallen so out of fashion. And that's the important part of a dramaturg's job, is to, as I always say, if there's a line standing behind Britney Spears or whatever, you start a new line somewhere, because she's got a line. And he's right now such a pariah that I wanted to make a case for him. And I love that play. And I think now it's possible that there might be a new production along these lines in the book upcoming, but I can't say anything about it yet.
We both are governed by non-disclosure agreements, but that's okay.
Yeah, not in New York, but in a big regional theater. But yes, so it ended up being more of me than I wanted.
Yeah, but I think that, to me, that makes the book much more engaging. Frankly, I don't want to say memoiristic aspect, but the sense that this isn't, like you said, a set of principles so much as this is how these principles actually played out in these circumstances. While you also caveat it with the incredible fortune of, this casting director or, this person, that, and just things that came together. It's a thread that runs throughout it. And I was glad you codified at the end that intuition and collaboration are key principles. And as a systematizing, micromanaging control freak, I realized it's the exact opposite of everything I do. And I would never be able to function in the world that you have. We can make the associations and connections, but I have to force them and refuse to accept any input.
I showed the little intro that I was asked to write to a couple of friends who were very, very experienced, well-known people in the theater. And they said, this could be any of our bios. Yeah. An actor who missed the subway and didn't make it to the audition. They had hoped to make it, so they had to go to another one and got the role that made them into a star. I mean, it is really a field of serendipity. And I've known many wonderful people, actors first of all, but others as well, who really were gifted, who just couldn't stand the serendipity of it. It's
writers in the same boat. I know people who, especially in this past year and a half. I spent 5 years working on Project X, and then the pandemic hits,
Yes.
2 weeks before the book comes out. And
some people correctly just can't stand it. It's too dangerous in a way. And it's always been that way. I mean, if you look at the life of Shakespeare, I mean, how many times were those theaters shut down by the plague? What did he do? I mean, those players show up in Hamlet in Denmark. They were probably a company like Shakespeare's out of work for a year.
Yeah.
It's like the pandemic, so they they took the wagon and they went up to Denmark. And Molière, he's having dinner with the king, and 3 months later he's pulling a wagon somewhere in France. I mean, either you like that or you don't,
What did the book teach you, both about dramaturgy and about yourself?
That's a very good question.
I know you had to break things down into some categories in order to do it, but
I mean, I think I did realize quite quickly on the as I call it, the tribal nature of it. Either you are a member or you aren't, which is to say, you collaborate, you come in, as every actor does, with a million ideas. You're trained, you're ready, you're rested, and then you don't take offense when 99 of your 100 wonderful ideas aren't used. And that's always the way it is. What if I try this? And then the director say, okay, interesting, but let's move to this. And if you are irritated by that, it's not going to work. And I have seen so many brilliant ideas that just didn't work for that moment or that play. So you have to have that personality as well. And I try and I think sustain through the whole book a sense of you have to have a certain positive energy about things. That if you don't understand something, you just have to keep working at it. And I like things that are hard to understand. And I think, we're just finishing this horrible year, coming back into life. I think that will remain. I mean, I know everyone's on Instagram. It's 30 seconds long and you see one thing. But on the other hand, there are millions of kids playing these insanely complicated video games, which require community and alliances and remembering and buying things. I mean, I've never played one, but they're not simple. And they take enormous, in fact, maybe two. If we had that in the theater, we would be in good shape. So I don't think that's a part of our brain that's going out of existence. And when something is really human and speaks to you and complicated and new, and this can range from, your comment earlier about Coast of Utopia to me on the phone, to Hamilton, people just love that. And I saw Hamilton at the Public, and I went back 3 years later with my sister from Hawaii, and just because she hadn't seen it, got a ticket. It was, completely full, of course, 2 tickets, and to my utter astonishment, and I didn't even know who was in it. It was like the fourth cast, and I had even forgotten where this was, but suddenly the audience stands up and as one says, "We're immigrants. We get the job done." It's like, wow.
Yeah, and I guess that's that question I have, that you get the communal aspect of theater in a way you don't get from any of the other media or other forms
Correct.
that we're talking about. Where did that first impress itself on you? That sense of
I mean, I tried
the theatrons.
the theatrons. I mean, it's something that as a theater person. But I quote early on that interesting article by the then head of the Columbia Education I hope I have that right, the Columbia Education School. Is that the name of the school? We'll look it up. It's in the book.
We'll do a caveat at the end.
Anyway, he was really brilliant. He wrote a piece for the magazine. I edit a literary magazine with John Guare as part of my job. And this was years ago, like maybe 20 years ago. And he said, it's odd what's happening on the campus. There are only two places where people really get along, they collaborate, they work as a group together easily, and that's sports and theater. They're different people, very different backgrounds, but they all know what they're doing and they know how to adjust. Maybe they're playing a particular position in sports. They're very good at that. That's their thing. But if something happens, they know how to adjust.
They'll have to interact with each other.
That's right. And or maybe they have to run to another base and do something they don't normally do. But they know the game so well that they can. And that's a typical theater story too. Somebody passes out and an understudy goes on. So and that is that. This was right at the beginning of this time that we're in. And he said that's something that I'm seeing. It's very prescient, way back. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. And as I say at the beginning, it's not a particularly intellectual profession. I mean, there are some of us who can come in with lots of information from scholarly sources. But as I say, if you stop a tech rehearsal and turn the house lights on and say, everybody come out and stand together and hold hands, dressers will come out. The costume shop, I used to work in a costume shop, will come out. The crews will come out. The ushers will come out. I mean, it's really a cross section of the country. I mean, not everyone has gone to college, and that is the daily life of the theater. And if it's run well, it's pretty ideal. If it's run badly, everybody's fighting, but I guess that's the way it is.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's the commonality with mankind. But are there differing schools within dramaturgy?
No.
Okay. I was sort of wondering if it's so all-encompassing that you can,
it's
go in different directions.
It's interesting. I think one of the reasons that the Yale asked me to write this book is, what the hell is it? But a lot of what's published about it has been from academic presses. I mean, not that Yale isn't an academic press, but it's been very theoretical and scary. I mean, sometimes I don't even really understand it. But that's where publishing has gone, because that's what you need to do to move forward in publishing. So this is very consciously not theoretical. It's very hands-on, but it does contain a syllabus. I mean, it does contain a reading list. It's trying to be, I mean, it can be easily used as a textbook, but it's not doctrinaire in any way. I mean, I do hope that it's something that people can use to change the theater, that they can take it with them and then 20 years from now, the theater will be, as it always is, unrecognizable.
In fact, what's changed? You say it's been about 50 years.
Oh my God!
For you, how is this? I don't want to say evolved, because that implies it's headed towards some optimal point.
Yeah,
it's
not headed towards any optimal point. I mean, it's been going for 2,500 years.
Yeah. I thought you had an interesting piece about the different waves of American theater writing at one point, and also the professionalization of theater in the 90s and what that has led to.
Well, I mean, I'm always somebody who's thinking about things, what should be done and what needs to be done. And that's how the Directors Lab came about. And, many examples I've cited, others I cited. I just did this great Legacy Playwrights Initiative. So many, it came about because a very famous playwright was inducted into the Theater Hall of Fame, old, and didn't have the money to take a train to the ceremony. And I happened to be having lunch with a woman now retired from D.C., who had been at a foundation that had funded the Directors Lab in a very big way, starting at the beginning. And she said, I just read this biography I read this obituary of a lawyer, an attorney, who died, who had been visiting a client who was like a Motown fanatic, and some great Motown song came on, and I was waiting in the living room, and there was a cleaning woman working, and she said, "Oh, I'm singing on that song." And he said, "Did you get paid?" And she said no. So he sued Atlantic Records. His name is Howard Boggle. He sued Atlantic Records for $12 million. Everybody who was on the recordings that they issued got paid. And then he sued them again for $12 million to set up a foundation. And I thought, it's very similar in a way, because, everyone's looking for the new thing, but there are plays that have been very successful, that reach audiences, that are often by writers of color, that have just been forgotten. And so we created this initiative with the Dramatists Guild Fund and other really smart, interested theater people. So there are always things to do. Right now, I think that in a big way, I mean, what happened to the regional theaters over the course of these decades was they got staffed. There was always a few people on the business end, of course, to keep track of the money, but they needed people to read the scripts. The playwrights were in residence. There were actually playwrights paid to be, the resident writer of Circle Repertory Theater or Actors Theater of Louisville or whatever. But then as the years went by, boards were built up, and it was always clearer to people on boards what a finance director did. Of course, you need a finance director, or what marketing was. But what the artistic side was less clear. Yeah. And so the business side got bigger. If you look at the staff lists in regional theaters, and the artistic staff got smaller, and especially the artists part of it got smaller. And we have a publication called American Theater, which is published by TCG, which is our national service organization. And in the back of American Theater, now online, used to be mailed to everybody, it would list the repertory of every theater in the country. And there are a lot of theaters, because after the regional theaters were founded, that's the way theater is, there were a whole group of people who didn't like that theater, and they would start an alternative theater. That's good. So then there would be the anti-regional theater, and then someone else would start a third, and then that's when you have a theater scene, is when you have a bunch of theaters that have different missions and stuff. And so as the years went by, the artists were kind of pushed out of the theaters, just because it was like, well, why do we have to have a writer in residence or a director in residence? Because we could just hire them. And you begin to see a kind of uniformity. So in the back of American Theater, you would see so many plays being produced that you had never heard of. In Florida and Texas and Seattle was a big scene, and Portland and Alaska, Perseverance Theater. And then as the decades passed, it was the same plays that would win the Tony or that would have some recognition that would be done, like, for example, our production of Vanya, Sonia, Masha, and Spike by Christopher Durang, which we did at Lincoln Center. It moved to Broadway. Sigourney Weaver was in it, Chris Nielsen, good cast. I think that was done 50 times regionally. So it was the same plays that you would see. So right now, if God appointed me czar of the theater, I would put all my efforts into the regional theaters and hook them up with, make sure their mayor comes to the opening night of every play, and have a bar next door to the theater with a drink named after the show, so that it just becomes embedded in the community, which will be delighted to support it. And there are theaters like this, I know, because from my director's lab, I have directors who are directing in theaters in Los Cruces, New Mexico, and in Provo, Utah. There's a lot of theater in Utah, Salt Lake, but you don't hear about that. And that seems to me, it's sort of like the Federal Theater Project. That seems to me to take theater out of the universities and put it back into the communities. And many theaters had, still do some in a few cases, conservatories. So you would go there to train. You would take classes, but you would hold the book, but you would absorb the culture of the theater while being part of a working theater community, which is definitely not the case in some universities. I mean, you're part of a university theater community, which may be quite different.
Yeah, one of my past guests who is he's done everything in theater and translation. He runs a theater in St. Louis. I hit him up before this and he echoed some of those sentiments. He said, we've produced plays, their world premiere basically, or their first translation into English. And then we hit the publishing companies with, hey, we've got this script. We're kind of going to stick with the ones we know we can sell lots of copies of and see proliferate. And it's just the same thing. He said these things should be successes, and yet they get crowded out by 50 versions of the same Broadway hit that people want to see in their smaller towns.
Yeah, and you could certainly have a balance of that because you have, 4, 5, 6 shows a year. You could do a couple of hits, and then you could do some things that are just as good that don't have an award attached to them yet.
Right. Things that can start building an audience and start building a more vibrant scene.
Yeah.
It's that's an ongoing thread throughout this podcast over 10 years now, is that sense of sticking with what's successful and, kind of starving everything else of attention. And that's sort of why I go around hunting down people who, I would love to hear from, even if it's a weird thing that people don't normally think of, like the art of dramaturgy is a neat topic. So you did mention what not to say to either the actors or, people working on a play. What have you learned about what not to say? What's the...
Well, I think you have to... and it's the same with every person in the theater. You develop a sense of when to speak and when not to speak. Mm-hmm. And in every instance, there are people who are just all over me and all over the director, of course, first, all over it, and others who just have a process that it's complete. And then there are others, like in The Ghost of Utopia, the wonderful Amy Irving, who played, everyone played numerous roles except for Brian, who played Alexander Herzen for hours every performance. I love him. They all played multiple roles. That was part of the sort of ethos of the production. Is that in the first play you were one person, in the second play you were another, etc. And Amy played the matriarch, the mother of Bakunin in the first play, and then she played the wife of Ogariev, who was Bakunin's friend. And she wanted so much information, but unlike the others who were highly documented. I mean, Herzen wrote, many books, and
was written about
by very important writers. But you have that sort of female problem. No one wrote about the wife of Bakunin's mother, or the wife of the patriarch of that estate. No one wrote about the biographies of the wife of Ogariev. I mean, there's no voice there. And that's why George Sand is so important in Utopia, because she was such a prolific writer and thinker. And so I didn't have much to give Amy, because there wasn't, other than just general information, which I was happy to do. So sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. But it's always surprising what people feel like they want to know, or what people feel like they already need, or they don't. I mean, and I mentioned my beloved Jennifer Ely, who I just adore, mm-hmm. and that was a very funny adventure. Everyone admires Alexander Herzen, the hero of Coast of Utopia. He was an incredible guy, and I can't remember now the number of years, 12 years before the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, thanks to his efforts, he was the leader. He freed 6 times as many serfs as Lincoln did freeing the slaves. I mean, his impact on history was just enormous. It was his money, his ideals, his writing, the publishing of these newspapers, and yet he's a totally forgotten man. I mean, it's such a great subject for Tom Stoppard, as usual. He went right to it like a dog on a hunt, So there's oodles of stuff about him. He wrote it, he was written about, etc. And always less stuff about the women. But Jennifer could not understand why the wife of Alexander Herzen, who herself had been a serf, I mean, she was I mean, it's an incredible story. It's in the book, the product of, she was the product of a serf harem that was in the back of a large Moscow mansion owned by a very, 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 very rich Russian nobleman who had multiple serfs to service him, and she was one. And they were all the children were being sent to live on the estates and work in the fields, and she was so pretty. They were paraded by her aunt to say goodbye, the princess so-and-so, and she was pulled out and said, "You're going to be raised as a gentlewoman." And she fell in love with Herzen, and they had a very happy marriage, had a child who was deaf, and then in the middle of the revolution of 1848, she has this wild affair with this total jerk, Georg Herwegh, who was kind of like what was the name of that Russian, Yevchenko, remember that Russian poet who came to America like 20 years ago, who was kind of had long hair, and he was really cool. He was the Jim Morrison of poets. That's Georg Herwegh. I mean, absolutely inconsequential. And Jennifer just said, I just do not understand how someone like Natalie Herzen, who's married to Alexander Herzen, would do this. And so I thought, I don't know, so I went down, it's in the book, I learned many years ago how to sneak into the NYU library, into the stacks. I won't give that secret away. And I found, of course, some 3 volumes of untranslated Georg Herwegh, who was kind of like a Yevtushenko person back then. Never translated, and it will never be translated. It's not very good stuff. But there was a pretty sexy poem, and so I translated it and secretly gave a copy to David Harbour, who was playing Herwegh, and one to Jennifer. And I think that's the reason that she was having a fling with him. So you find yourself doing all, here I am sneaking into the NYU library but that's what she needed, because she just couldn't figure it out, because it wasn't something intellectual. It wasn't something you could read about. It was something else that we all understand.
And that's, again, when you talk about the indeterminacy of what a dramaturg does, but it's also in keeping with Stoppard and the lost letters, or, like Arcadia, which is my all-time favorite modern piece of theater. Those things that we never know because they got burned, but that explains, there's some key to people's behavior,
yes,
I guess.
Yes.
I guess there's a fear of being too reductionist with that stuff. And
well, I mean, it's things like, that's what's so exciting, and it's just it needs so many people to do this. I mean, I hope there are hundreds of dramaturgs who get started on this. But what is to be found in archives? Yeah. I mean, I read a reference recently, after this book was printed, that somebody had published a list of 100 French female playwrights from the 18th century. 100 French. I mean, I didn't know there was one French female playwright. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things that that was our wonderful experience with Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston's Mulebone. It's like, here we are. Here's this thing that exists. And sort of the leading light on that production was, of course, Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates, who, it's hard to believe, he was still at Duke. That was his first professorship at that point. He was still engaging in conversations, can black people write? I mean, it's just hard to imagine that existed, but it certainly did, and it was an issue for us for a long time in theater criticism, where when we would do non-traditional casting, there would be tremendous backlash against that. But anyway, so he just said, screw it, I'm just going to start publishing. So he published encyclopedias of African-American writing, encyclopedias of African writing, and now he's got encyclopedias of slave narratives by women that are, 700 pages long. I mean, there's so much in print now that conversation doesn't ever happen anymore. And he was, at the time of Mulebone, getting Zora into print. Now Zora is like the heroine of, female literature. Nobody had ever heard of her. And the reason that she is because he got Random House to publish every single thing she wrote in individual volumes. That was happening as we were doing Mulebone. And of course, Langston had always been the sort of poet laureate of African Americans from, I don't know, when he first began. But he had sort of fallen out of favor because he was too embracing of, just in general, he wrote for the Chicago Defender of actual life. He was not a literary writer, although he was, of course, a literary writer. But he was not as cool as Richard Rider. He wasn't as cool as Baldwin. And it was Arnold Rampersand's brilliant biographies, 2 volumes. He said there was so much to write about. It would have been better to have 1 volume. But he just discovered every major African American writer of the last 50 years. When they were teenagers, they would send him poems, and he would write them letters. Alice Walker, Lucille Clifton, you're very good. And they're 17 years old. He was an amazing person. So how could we not produce this play? It was just such a find that it had to be. And you can multiply that times a factor of whatever. There's so many plays that can be discovered, that need to be discovered, that are just waiting, and that are very popular, which is a key part. That you want something that lives in the world, that speaks to people, that people come together over, and so that's an exciting part of the job as well. That sort of, sitting in the basement and going through manuscripts part.
Prefer working with living authors or dead? You mentioned in one of the last chapters the thrill of working on a classic, but
yeah. I like plays that are, that are very emotionally deep, and to before we began broadcasting, I was talking about rereading Thomas Mann. When he began from really a very unartistic family in a nowhere place, he wrote things that just see down into the century, decades before they happened. Who was this guy? How could he know this? And so when you work on plays, and there are, of course, many classics, all of Shakespeare, in my opinion, Greeks, Moliere, but O'Neill, Shoyenka. It doesn't really matter who the writer is. It takes you a while to really understand what's going on, and you have to stand on the shoulders of all the other people who've come before you, who've tried to figure that out.
Yeah, is that a danger, an excessive reverence towards either the play itself or to past interpretations?
Well, it's first of all, it's impossible, but you should never do another person's interpretation. If it's been interpreted in some way in 1860, it's not going to work in 2020. Sure. But the great thing about looking at past interpretations is that you get all kinds of ideas that you can steal, and I don't mean that you would take anything whole-handed, but it gets very granular. How to make an entrance. Viola makes her first entrance. I can't remember who did this. It was more recent. It was like Helen Hayes or somebody. She comes in and before she speaks her first line, she takes off her shoe, and you have to imagine, I don't know what it was, but I can imagine what kind of shoe it was, and shakes sand out of her shoe. There goes the first 8 pages of exposition. You know exactly what's happening. Yeah. She's on a beach. She's been on a ship. She's dressed a certain way. Such a smart actor idea. Or I don't know, maybe it was the director's idea. But you sort of pick and choose from standing on the shoulders of people who came before you, or people who, like those very early people who claim that they were, descended from Shakespeare and they knew how he wanted this to be. Of course, we have no idea if that's true or not. But sometimes that will then prompt you to think of something. But you're always trying to use that to speak to the people who are in your audiences today. You don't want to do anything that, would have been appropriate in 1950 or 1850. It's got to be appropriate for 2021 or soon 2022. But you can get a lot of ideas from smart people who have tried it all out before.
Speaking of 2021 and 2020, how's the pandemic been? How's it affected what you do in the theater?
It's such a. I mean, I think the theater is needed more than ever by a factor of 100, just because of its collaborative nature. I mean, our country has been riven by dissent. And if only theater people were in charge of it, we would be in. I mean, it's just unreal to close down a show. We closed down Flying Over Sunset, a new musical by James Lapine, 3 hours before its first preview. We sent emails to 1,100 people who had tickets for the first performance. Many of them didn't get them. We had to station people at the locked doors to say we're closed. And then 20 of us watched the entire show. I mean, like a brand new Broadway musical, which will return shortly in November. And I've just watched everybody fighting for the last two year and a half, almost 2 years, fighting about everything, about politics, about vaccines, about I don't know, and I think that the theater has always existed. I mean, again, if you go back to the Greeks, I mean, everyone in the polis, everyone in the community sat together and watched the plays. And yes, I know women could not participate, but there are a few, and I mean really a few reputable artifacts of commentary that come down from Greek 5th century BC drama. And one of them is that when the Eumenides appeared on stage, men fainted and women had miscarriages. So there must have been women in the audience because men can't have miscarriages. Right. But what you see is the polis gathering together to really figure out how people should live together. How do you move from a hunter-gatherer society to a agriculture-based, you can't have a tradition of, you kill my brother and feed him his children and then I kill your, how do you stop this cycle of violence? That's what those plays are about. It's not a coincidence that, Freud based all of his theories on Greek plays. I mean, it's the darkest possible, urges and issues in mankind that are resolved communally by the community. And the various tribes who were represented voted on the winners of the Dionysia competitions. So, I mean, it had a civic as well as an artistic function. And the theater, I think, has always been able to do that. You can look at Shakespeare's theater and, I've been teaching at Juilliard forever. I mean, if you look at the population of London in 1603, it's something like 330,000 people. I always say it's like Scranton, and the capacity of these theaters they were like 2,000 seats, like big Broadway houses. The Beaumont's only 1,100. So a lot of people went to the theater, and they would, this has been argued by greater minds than my own, but if you had a problem, like just something that question that you just asked me, and it was 1596, where would you go to think about that problem? Obviously, you'd go to church. That would be the primary place that you would go. You could also go to an alchemist. You could be bled. Yeah. That was possible. That was also possible. But you could also go to the theater. And there are many examples, if you look at the verse of these plays. Obviously, it's iambic pentameter, but at the end of certain speeches, there are these couplets, which are called sententia, which people would write on little boards, and it was kind of words of wisdom that people would take home with them. So it wasn't like, getting a direct answer to your question, like take 2 aspirins and go to bed, but it was just a kind of change of how you think about things. So there's been this, the theater's entertainment, the theater's art, but the theater's also a community binding form, and I see that as being necessary now more than ever.
But undercut by the entertainment capitalist thing.
I mean, it's been closed, first of all, for a year now.
Well, yeah, there's that part of it.
And
but,
I don't know. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what plays when we reopen. What plays. I mean, what successfully plays when we reopen. But I wonder. I mentioned video games before, but I wonder. Is TikTok going to satisfy people for the next decade, or is it going to be a fad that's going to be, move beyond?
A couple of years ago, it was Fortnite or whatever one of those things are that, like the guys at Netflix would say, we're not competing with HBO and this one and that one. We're competing with the time people are spending on video games. Mm-hmm. And then the next thing is how much you're spending on TikTok versus, I
mean, it's sort of, I don't know, maybe I'm just old. It can't get much shorter.
We keep saying that.
I know, it's really
we joked about short attention span theater back when I was
But there's so much, I mean, you can see just the God, it's so difficult reopening the theater. I mean, you can't imagine. We haven't reopened yet, but there are a few shows that have reopened. And the COVID protocols and everyone having to be tested and vaccinated. It takes forever to get the audiences in. They can't go to the bathroom, I mean, it's just, you can't imagine. And then you have all the union people you never see, the front of house staff. I mean, it's like moving an army, But at the same time, there's such joy that people feel to be back. And it's the theater, but it's also, dance parties. And I mean, people, we have an urge to do things collectively. I mean, I say we, people throughout history all over the world. And I just don't see that going away.
Fingers crossed. I had two past guests. One who wrote some of the music and songs for Moulin Rouge. The other one did the music for Sing Street, which was maybe 2 weeks from premiering.
I know, yeah.
And that was...
It'll come back.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, Gary's been posting about it, that they're working on the debut, but...
Gotta get everybody vaccinated.
Yeah, and even, I think it came out over the weekend, the Lion King production apparently had a breakthrough case.
Several have.
Yeah, and they shut down for 10 days
and there's a breakthrough case, but then sometimes it's a positive that turns out to be a false positive.
Yeah, I know. It's we're going through a lot of... Again, the fact that I'm going to a museum after this and being around human beings is a huge step for me at this point. So, we'll see how the rest of the afternoon goes. But there's a question, given the number of translators I have recorded with over the years, a number of them are wondering about work in translation. You mentioned in the book doing translation yourself as well as bringing in translations of work, especially the great chapter you have on a couple of Chinese
Yeah, The Orphan of Zhao from 1280.
Yeah. How do you work with translators while working on a production? Do you bring them into production sometimes, or is it, sort of arm's length commissioning? And tell me, how you work with translation.
Yeah, I mean, I one of the things I mentioned this in the book, but one of the things that I failed at in a big way that I really regret was a project I worked on with Carrie Perloff, who ran ACT for many years, which was the National Theater Translation Fund. And it's something that has been, well known about the United States. But if you really look at the population of America, I would say, you give me a number, half of America speaks two languages. All immigrants speak a language and then they learn English. It's not that hard to learn another language, but it's always been this thing that Americans don't speak other languages, or they're not interested in other cultures, or it's so hard to learn. And now I think again, I'm not too aware of everything, but I mean, I think we've eliminated languages in colleges. We've eliminated literature from different languages, from different cultures. I mean, it's I don't know what the problem is. We just don't seem to be able to be interested in other cultures. And I think that's beginning to change. I hope that's beginning to change. But it's not that hard to do. And when you understand another language by mastering it, you have to, and it helps you, understand another culture and another way of life, no matter what language you're learning.
Yeah.
And that is a very, very interesting thing to do, to see, because language reflects the reality of how people live in the world. What do they have words for? What do they not have words for? What's the grammatical structure of the language?
Even how you construct sentences can demonstrate a very different way of how you see the world and how you see time than
so I'm definitely, on come down on the side of, I think literal translations are ridiculous. I
used to be a fan of Pavir and Volokonsky, the ones who were doing all the Russians, because that's what came up when I was in college. They did the Brothers K, and that was the big thing.
Remember.
And this week, because I have cancer, rereading the Death of Ivan Ilyich and realizing it really is as clunky as the criticism has been lately. I have to go find some of the older translations and
But they speak Russian, don't they?
She does. He doesn't. And he's a poet and takes her literal translation and poeticizes things. And apparently, I started reading criticism in recent years saying, Pavir and Volokonsky aren't actually getting these things across. You might want to go back to Aylmer Maude and Constance Garnett and people like that.
Well, I mentioned that. Actually.
You mentioned Garnett in.
I mentioned when I was in graduate school, I took a class on translation with Eric Siegel, the guy who wrote Love Story. Funny life, huh? He wrote Love Story. That's what we know him for. But he was actually professor of classics at Yale, and he taught a class in translation. And to get into the class, you had to speak 3 languages. And we translated Catullus, which is pretty easy. And that was my takeaway, just to answer your original question about translation. I mean, so Catullus has been translated for 1,000 years or whatever. And you can immediately see what era the translation is from.
Yeah.
Because the translator, I mean, there's 1 or 2 exceptions on certain poems where the translator is a great poet and it's hard to know, but it's obviously a Victorian translation. It's obviously a 60s translation. It needs to be retranslated every decade, unless you are lucky enough to get some amazing person. But the word literal translation, I mean, is just meaningless. I mean, if you take any word, just a woman, is it woman, gal, dame? I mean, it's located socially, it's located time-wise. I mean, it's a female person, but the choice of what word to use for that tells you a great deal about...
There's a difference between lady and woman.
Yeah, or whatever,
But as far as bringing translators in, when you're working on a production, is that something...
Well, first of all, we haven't done many, I'm trying to think in my life, how many foreign plays. I mean, when we did Orphan, which I write about in some length, we had so many Chinese people working on it. Yeah. And it's a classic, even though it was written in 1280s. It's a fantastic play. And it's also not long, and it's also really good. So everybody knew it. So every time there was talk about anything, half the company and the creative people would just have an opinion. No, we like this, or don't do this, or whatever. And then we had a very, very brilliant director, Shizhen Chen, who had opinions about how he wanted to do it, which was to pare away a lot of stuff. So we didn't really have... I mean, we had David Greenspan was our author. He did not speak or read Chinese, but we had 18 people talking about every, we read the play through aloud. That's really a good way to always do a play. And then everybody had an opinion. Well, and we would do that, I remember, and 3 people would say, well, that's an interesting line. I actually had asked Shishan to read it in Chinese. And then they would say, well, that's such a strange choice for that word. And then David would hear all this discussion. So that's kind of how that script evolved. And I've done, productions that I've translated myself. But I don't know that I've done a lot of
in terms
plays.
of bringing them in as collaborators.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what.
But I like Constance Garnett too. I mean, and when I did that Chekhov project, I read so many translations of Chekhov. Yeah. Those were Chekhov stories for the most part. But you grow fond of certain ones maybe it's you, or maybe you feel that you have access to them?
I did a blog post 1,000,000 years ago about the Maud's translation of Anna Karenina, because there's a line when Levin first sees Kitty that is one of the most poetic and beautiful lines in the world. And then I started looking at everyone else's translation. No one writes it exactly the way they do. And by the time you get like more and more modern and more quote unquote literal, it's the clunkiest description in the world. And you realize in 1900, those guys knew.
It's very hard.
How to get it across.
I mean, I wanted to translate a poem that I thought would be great for the New Yorker years ago. It's been in my desk at the office for 25 years, and I cannot do it. It's not a long poem, but it's not even that complicated a poem, but it's just a certain way of expressing something where the language expresses not only the emotions but the dilemma. And I cannot figure out how to do it in English.
Who's the poet? Or
no. It's the author of Big and Little, whose play I translated for published by Forrest Strauss. And I wish I could, and I take it out from time to time. I have the first 2 lines. It's only like a 14-line poem, but I can't get the third and fourth. I just can't figure it out.
Do you have a dream project?
Oh, I have so many dream projects.
I sort of figured, and I don't know if it's the sort of thing you don't want to give away, certain stuff, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us who work as dramaturgs have projects that we're just unbelievably passionate about.
Yeah.
And when I was running Lambda, I created this newsletter where we would it was mostly devoted to new plays then, but here's this amazing writer, and I cannot get my artistic director to do it, and then we would send it around to all the dramaturgs, and a lot of productions resulted from that. But there's certain ones, I mean, I tried enormously hard to get Adrian Hall, who is I think he's still alive, although I think he has dementia. He is an amazing man, as I mentioned. It's very odd that Robert Wilson, Garland Wright, and Adrian Hall all came from rural West Texas at the same time.
You mentioned that.
Isn't that odd? I mean, they're so different. Anyway, Adrian Hall founded Trinity Repertory Theater with his colleague was the designer Eugene Lee, and you would know Eugene Lee because he's the designer of Saturday Night Live. You always, very Brechtian. You see the cameras, you see the audience, all the bones are revealed, and all of his work at Trinity was like that. Then he took over Dallas Theater Center. I mean, he was a major player, and he was a friend of Robert Penn Warren, or he would say Red Warren.
Yeah, Red. I was trying to remember the nicknames.
And he had been working. His life's work which he had started with Red, if I may call him that, was to do an adaptation of All the King's Men. This is so pre-Trump, which is about Huey Long.
It's one of my favorite novels. But
it's not about Huey Long. And having endless conversations with him, I tried so hard to get this on. He got Randy Newman, before anybody knew who Randy Newman was, to write the music. Sail Away is a song about a slave ship coming into Charleston Bay. All the music is Randy Newman music, and Randy Newman's pretty well known right now. But it is about the sister and brother, Jack and Amanda Burton, who enable Huey Long, or whatever his name is.
Willie Stark.
Willie Stark, yeah. I mean, what is this, I don't want to use the word weakness, but what is this susceptibility in Americans for this particular type of...
Listen, that was my Harold Bloom conversation beginning of 2016. We sat down to record, and I asked, what are you reading? And he said, it can't happen here because I'm terrified of Trump. I guess it's January 2016. Harold, you're insane. He said, you have no idea where everything is headed. Yeah. And I had no idea where everything was headed.
But It Can't Happen Here is not as good a book as All the King's Men.
No, but that just happened to be the one he was reading at the moment for that reason.
And that is the mystery at the heart of that book.
Yeah.
It's not that, it's not what happened to Willie Stark or what happened to Huey Long, who luckily, was put out of his out of this life before he could cause damage. But why did he get so far? Not only on the part of the population, but the part of these two characters. That's something I'd love to discuss and think about in a production.
Off mic, I'll talk to you a little bit about the 4 years of lobbying that I was engaged in down in D.C. and what I've learned about power and the proximity to it, but not on mic because, somebody down there might be listening. Did you write plays yourself? Had you ever been tempted?
No. I mean, I recommend in the book, and I believe this, that everybody who wants to be a dramaturg should try everything. I mean, I have acted. It was a night. I mean, as I say, there are two kinds of people in the theater: people who will do anything to get on a stage, and the people who will do anything to get off a stage. I'm a pretty good seamstress. I've done that. I directed, and a number of plays, and found myself at midnight one night on a phone call where I heard myself saying, "But you're wonderful." And I thought, you know what? I want someone else to do this. It's just not my thing. So I think you have to, find what you're good at, but find what you feel is you. And I like very much the anonymity of dramaturgy. And I love this guy who I only found out about recently, Kurt Hirschfeld, who's my epigram.
Yeah, I was going to say, he's the subject of the...
God, what that guy did. I mean, first of all, he's Jewish. So he gets to Zurich. That already would be enough for most people to save your life. You get out of Berlin, in the 30s. But then he goes back and he gets every major Jewish actor out of Berlin. They have a job in Zurich. They must, and the artistic director doesn't even know that he's doing this, and he creates the greatest acting company and saves all these people. That's enough to go to heaven. I mean, that's already. Then, again, you forget all these things unless you really think freshly about them. I mean, they're not going to do plays that are not appropriate to Mr. Hitler in Italy because he's allied with Mussolini, okay? You know what's going on in Spain. He's conquering everything in northern, Finland and Sweden. I mean, France is occupied. Where are these writers going to be done? Where are these people going to be performed? And so he introduces the entire modern European repertory. T.S. Eliot, Eugene O'Neill. I mean, if you go to Europe now, you'll see these plays done. He did that in Zurich. He's the only one who got Brecht any money during the war because he produced all the premieres of his plays, because who else was going to do them? And then, if that isn't enough, he does what every dramaturg should do, which is that he finds new writers. Max Frisch and Friedrich Dürrenmatt, one of whom wins the Nobel Prize. I mean, come on. And then he's totally forgotten.
And you're okay with, outside of putting out a book with your name on it, you're okay with the degree of anonymity? The issue of credit comes up in the book a few times.
Yes.
But as far as that goes, it's more the credit among your peers?
Well, I mean, when you do work, you should get paid for it and you should get credited for it.
Yeah.
And I think the amount of work and the time it takes to do the work is about the same as a designer. So I've always said dramaturgs should be billed and paid as like designers. And I was running the National Dramaturgs Organization, Lambda, Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas, before I came to Lincoln Center, before I had kids, when I had time to do that. And my dream had been to merge it with SDC, which is the Society of Stage Directors and Choreographers at that point, because that is a union, and this is just a guild.
Yeah.
It has model contract, etc. But
no collective bargaining power or anything.
Exactly, yeah. And there are a lot of members, too. I mean, there could be membership dues, but it's not fair to use the work of people and not pay them. And actually, getting back to the Legacy Project, it's oddly a particular, just like it was bad in Motown. It's a problem actually in the American theater, not in the theaters, but more in academia. That you have writers, especially writers of color of a certain age, who are revered, who are taught by Xeroxing PDFs of their plays. And so the writers get nothing. So they're lionized, but they're broke. And even more importantly, all writers have very specific things that they want, how they want their plays done. They want a certain kind of casting. They want, they don't want changes in the text. And the Dramatists Guild, which is a terrific organization, very powerful. You don't screw around with them. When you're doing a play by an author, you do the play that they wrote as they wrote it, and you don't get to add in things or change things, or, if it calls for the character to be one way, you can't make it another way. And that doesn't exist in academia because they're not licensing through the guild. And the writers who are, revered don't like it. They're not getting any money. I guess it's the same in music. People aren't paid.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that the Legacy Project is trying to at least bring to awareness and remedy. And the irony is that so many of the colleges doing this have so much money.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, maybe they don't have it on the departmental level, but they certainly have it in other places. So it's sort of weird, not good.
Yeah, it's, my first love artistically is comics. I grew out of the whole superhero thing when I was a college kid, but you look at, all this whole Marvel thing and everything else, it's all built on guys who got paid a page rate and never saw a dime in royalties afterwards. The families are all suing now. And yeah, it's a degree of who can make money off of whom, I suppose. It's sense of exploitation. Can you think of a play that you grew into? Something you didn't
like?
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, you write about that a little with Brecht at the end about the life of Galileo, and how that play evolved for him over 16 or so years. Mm-hmm. But do you think of any plays that
you mean that I first didn't like and then I grew to like?
Into it.
Oh, yeah. God, that's a very good question.
I do that with novels all the time, so I'm sort of wondering if there's a theater corollary to it. My biggest thing throughout this whole book, what you really bring to me with this, is just the sense of the work in flux. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one thing that, it's being performed, so the very act of the play itself is transitory or transient in time, but also the sense, as you've brought up, of how things are changed, that there is no final version of a lot of these things. But,
yeah, I mean, I think the most important quote in the book, and I actually was forced to make a website. That was a big thing for me. I've never had a website. As I said, I'm not really that public a person. And I put it on the opening page as a quote by Michel Saint-Denis, who is really a hero of mine, a Frenchman who started, and I guess what would be the equivalent back in 1910 or so, of Moises Kaufmann's tectonic theater. He was with a group of people in a rural part of France writing plays based on the stories of people who lived there. Mm-hmm. I mean, sort of hands-on collective theater creation. Then he moved to England and ran the Old Vic and trained, and directed Sir Laurence Olivier and all of those people. I mean, the biggest names in English acting that you can imagine. And then he came and founded Juilliard. He was brought to start the drama division when it first began in America. Then that's where he died. And the quote that I have, which I don't even know where it is, or sort of know, is that there's simply one eternal theater. There's one core way of working together, but it is endlessly changing. And when you start a play, you need to know what are some things that made it possible. Did people have miscarriages in Greek theater? So, I'm the second son of Sir Roland Du Bois. What did that mean? Because you may not know that, So that kind of information is important. Knowing how to collaborate is important. Being egoless enough to offer up your ideas and your suggestions, your impulses as actors, your ideas as directors, and then have them be rejected and have new ones, that you're that creative that you can do that. But that the content of what you're doing, whether it's a new interpretation of a play or a new play, is endlessly changing. It's an endlessly changing thing. And to be fixed in any spot is the death of theater. And I have that fantastic quotation, which is just one of the serendipitous things that happen when you write a book, of Stanislavski wooing Chekhov. And it's such a fantastic quote because he had his first production in St. Petersburg at a theater I actually worked in a little, visited, which is the fanciest, biggest, Tsar-created theater. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It makes the Metropolitan Opera look like a hovel. It's amazing. Yeah. So very big time. And this little group down, Demirovich, Zanchenko, and Stanislavski, loved Chekhov, and they hated all that overacting, and they had a new way of thinking about theater, and they knew that Chekhov was their writer, so they had to talk him into saying no to this gigantic place and coming to work with them. And that's my quote. And Chekhov was not able to articulate what it was that he wanted. He kept saying, we're talking about Vanya here, that was the next play up, and they were going to do it at the big theater, and he kept saying something about a yellow scarf, and they couldn't understand what he was saying, and this is Chekhov we're talking about, and he kept saying, but it's the scarf. And finally they realized that it was that Vanya, stuck in the country, was wearing a scarf because he was actually as special and as educated as this idiotic professor who everybody revered, and that and we see that and he sees that, and that's the sort of heartbreaking tragedy of the play, but he couldn't articulate that. And of course, as you know, there's the inspiration part of writing, and then there's the entanglement part, and that has to do with getting permissions and all of this incredibly difficult stuff that you have to do to be able to use things. And the only way to tell this little story about Stanislavski and Demirovich, Zanchenko, and Chekhov is to tell it. And it was just too long, and it was still in copyright. And there's a limit of number of words. You have to count them and stuff. And it comes at the end of my section about playwrights' opinions about dramaturgs. The best thing a dramaturg ever said, this is my favorite section, the best thing a dramaturg ever said to me, and the worst thing a dramaturg ever said to me. So I thought, let me just end it with Chekhov. But I couldn't. And then they called from the press and said, it's January.
The copyright
it just
expired.
Went out
we can use it. It's a great ending
My
to that
life
chapter.
in order just went out of copyright. I'm like, wow. I mean, somebody's on my side here, because it's not something that's just happening today. It's always been the case.
Yeah, it's a really good chapter with the getting those playwrights to talk about their dramaturg experiences. And one of the great things throughout the book is, you cite a lot of the successes. When things weren't exactly successful, you don't name names. You don't trash anybody. You convey what didn't work without having to be.
And sometimes you know it at the time. I mean, you certainly know when it's not working, but you don't often know why. Yeah. And that's why, again, it's like with creating the direct stuff, you just want experience because it's just practice. It's like anything else. You just, like.
Yeah, when did you feel like you knew what you were doing, or have you ever felt that is this a field where you know what you're doing versus that intuitive sense you talk about?
I think thanks to my friendship with these two great dramaturgs, I sort of knew kind of how to get started on everything, and every project's different. But really, it's mostly dependent on your collaborators.
Sure.
And you could be doing everything you want to do, but if you have a director who's not leading the ship, or steering the ship, then you can do everything you want, and it's fruitless. So it's partially luck, casting, and I mean, I've worked on shows that were fantastic, but there's been one person in the cast who can't carry the weight. I mean, that was what was so amazing about Utopia, was that everybody was great. Everybody just carried their weight. And it was just thrilling to be part of an endeavor like that, because it's just so much easier. And I guess it's like anything, sailing a ship. It's like if one person can't pull up their sail, then you're going to have a problem winning the America's Cup. So a lot of things happen. I mean, there have been productions that I've worked on, and I talk about that in the Midsummer chapter. That was my first experience with James Lapine. That we really got set back, and we didn't have any idea this was happening, because our costume designer quit
right before production.
Yeah.
Oh, right before,
to do his first big Broadway show, which ran forever and paid him a lot of money. But we had a completely neutral environment. This brilliant idea of Heidi Landisman's to create a secret part of Central Park. I mean, this is the days when huge oak trees were flown in by helicopter. And so it was kind of like people would come in and be like, what is this? So it was this magic place. So nobody knew it was a magic place today or 600 years ago, or it was unclear. And so everything hinged on the clothes, because people are looking to see, are the clothes in period? What period? Is it modern? Are they funny? Are they serious? And in fairness to the person who eventually designed it, I mean, he hadn't been part of anything. So it ended up getting completely screwed up, because people want to latch on to what's the period? How should I take this? And so it really is a collective creation. I mean, everybody has to be in on things, and it isn't that, sometimes, I mean, I've worked, and I'm always in awe of, I was very close to Brian Dennehy, who did Galileo when we first did it in Chicago. I've mentioned Brian, or many others, John Cullum, I mean, these people are company leaders. They do their job. They're brilliant, but they also, I mean, Brian used to come, has always, I mean, he's passed away, but he would come to every rehearsal. He was always in the main role. Line perfect. And when you have a small role and you see the lead line perfect, you step it up and you learn your lines. I mean, I've worked on shows where the leads are not line perfect for a long time, and that's really difficult to do. And the ability to set an example and to be, friends with everybody, and to sort of, it's just like, it's like being a team captain on a football team.
I was going to say, it's the same thing as that academic brought up. It's, Michael Jordan apparently went all out in practice because he wants everybody else to go all out in practice.
Yes.
And that way,
and to evaluate, who in the company might be feeling this or that and need a word, or, that is just something that certain great actors have, and other actors who are good just can't do it. They don't know how to do it. And that's something that no dramaturg can help with at all. That just depends on
their personal chemistry background and all that.
Yeah.
Last question, because I have pitched him, but he has said no, so I'm never going to get him on unless something drastically changes. Any good Stoppard stories from when you worked on Coast of Utopia?
Oh, I just adore him.
I thought I could leverage the Clive James thing, but his people said no, he's not interested. I'm like,
Yeah, I sent him the book. I sent him. No, I think Yale sent him the book, and the Bernie interview, because he was very close to Bernie. And I said, if nothing else, just listen to, because I thought he might be interested. I spent a lot of time with him during that. I mean, he was around a lot.
That's what I'm wondering, if you had any good.
There's a lot of stuff he doesn't know in here, and I thought he would be interested. But I haven't heard anything from him, and I did hear recently that he was doing a radio thing around Leopoldstadt, where he said things are right now. If I say one word wrong, my career will be wiped out. Let's see.
He's one of those guys who's coming from an age where they're very sensitive about cancel culture, because they're used to a very different set of standards as to what you can say and who you can say
I
things
mean,
to.
I didn't know when he was young, so there was. I knew nothing that has anything to do with it.
Yeah, I don't think there's things he has said in the past. I think it's just I've seen friends get blown up for X, Y, and Z. I don't want to get blown up.
But I really was hoping he would. I mean, he doesn't blurb books, or I didn't expect him to talk about it, but I was very curious what he would say about this.
Oh, I'm sure you'll end up hearing at some point from him that, you know.
I hope so. I hope so.
Any good stories from when you were working with him? Was there any?
Just, I mean, I think one of my favorite things, looking back over a lifetime, and I had this experience with many people, and I had this experience with Tom, is this wonderful time, very long, in technical rehearsals. When all the actors are on stage, except for those who aren't, who are in the house, it's empty, it's dark, the lighting designers are working like crazy, the stage managers are really working like crazy, the director is working, and then other people are just sitting in the house watching, and in darkness. And it is the most wonderful bonding experience. And I've had that experience, and actors who are not in the scenes come up and sit with you, and a lot of bonding with costume designers, because the costumes are made, they're being worn. Once you get to actually, the tech rehearsals are without costumes until they are with costumes. So fabulous conversations with costumes. I love costume designers, all designers. And then I sat many, many times with Tom in the darkness, and you just sit there for 4 hours, and chat, or and it's a wonderful thing. I did a big interview with him, public interview during Utopia, and on the way, like 500 people across the street up in the Kaplan penthouse, and on the way over we were walking, and he said, "Please," as I said, "is there anything you don't want me to ask you?"
It's always a good thing to ask.
Yeah, and he said, "Just don't ask me what I'm working on, because my mind is empty." Yeah. Which is sort of exactly how I feel right now. Whatever was in here in my head is in this book. So I said, "Fair enough, I will not ask you that," and I didn't. But I just, I just admire the complexity of his thinking, and I admire the, again, as I say in this chapter, I mean, it took me so long to understand this play, and I'm sure there are things I still don't understand, but scenes, little tiny scenes that I thought, oh, let's get rid of them, they're holding things that turned out to be so necessary. They were like little bright spots of humor. He was so ahead of me, and that's a wonderful feeling to be. I mean, Liviu Chule said that. I put that in the book too. If you're climbing Mount Everest, take all the help you can get. So I just am very fond of him, and I'm a great admirer. As I am of Shizhen Chen, as I am of Mark Lemos, as I am.
That's a very affectionate book. I mean, you really demonstrate the heart.
And my relationship with Wendy, my God, I mean, it was just the core relationship of my life, and I'm such a fan of Sarah Ruhl. I love Robert Wilson. I mean, it's really love. As I said, it's maybe a strange thing to talk about in a book about dramaturgy, but writers of that level of talent, you're in awe of them. They're really amazing. And so to be able to live a life in that world, ever changing. You're in Russia, and then Sarah Ruhl's working on a new play about the Salem witch trials. I can't wait. I mean, it's just your life is always. I know the strangest things, given what I've been lucky enough to work on, and so it's never a boring job.
Again, I think you do a wonderful job with the book of again, the history of it, the literariness of it, but also that sense. As somebody who is really focused on micromanaging and controlling things, you show me what the nature of collaboration is and what a joy it is. So,
and I hope I've put a syllabus at the end. I mean, I really think it can be taught, and much of the writing about dramaturgy has become, maybe it's because it's coming out of academia now, is very dry and theoretical. There's nothing theoretical in this book. It's actually how to do it. And so that's included in the back. So it's kind of a textbook, but it's got a whole it has to have a personal side to it, because whoever's going to use this will have their own personality added to the mix. Certainly not mine. It's just meant to be a model of how to get started. But new people will take over and put their own mark on the theater.
It's been going on for 2,500 years. And thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And that was Anne Cattaneo. Go check out The Art of Dramaturgy from Yale University Press. I know it's a textbook, but it's a really good book. I think if you're like me and you dig the literary arts and what goes into making a work of art, what it means to interact with an audience, all that stuff is there. And it's a really fascinating approach to this stuff. And I'm so thankful that David Leopold connected us, because this book is fantastic. So again, even if you're not studying to become a dramaturg, this will teach you a lot about what goes into making theater and where the magic lies, and how so many elements can come together, both in terms of the words and the performance and the design and the staging, but also, there are parallels to this with literary writing and editing that, I think those of you who are writers out there might get a lot out of this. So, Anne, during the conversation, mentioned her website, and that is theartofdramaturgy.com. I will not bother to spell that, but you'll find links to it in the show and episode notes for this one. You can also hit lct.org to find out more about Lincoln Center Theater. And not on social media, as we know, that's for the best. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know that there's this guy who's doing these long conversations with really interesting people every week. Also, you can let me know what you like and don't like about the show, what movie, TV show, book, piece of music, piece of theater, piece of art you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, by postcard or letter. It's not too tough to find out my address. Or you can leave me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes straight to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in a conversation with me. You can leave a message up to 3 minutes long. If you're going to be longer than that, call back and leave a second one. And let me know if it's okay to use your message in an upcoming episode of the show. Now, that's how you can support me. I did spend some money on this one. I took the ferry over from New Jersey into the city, so $18 for that, $16 for parking, or vice versa. But I did a lot of walking otherwise. I walked to Ann's, and I walked all the way down to the Whitney to see the Jasper Johns exhibition, which is the thing I was going to talk about at the intro, but we'll go into it some other time. Anyway, I don't need your money. If you have money to spare, I hope you'll use it to support individuals or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and other crowdfunding mechanisms. There are a lot of people out there who, especially medical needs, some people who are trying to fund an arts project. You can help with that stuff. As far as institutions go, you could look to your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, election funds. There are a lot of things you can do if you've got a couple of dollars to spare that can help us work towards a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.